5 siblings, alone, pressed against a brick wall in a freezing Chicago alley at midnight. The oldest, 14 years old, was bleeding from his face, shielding the others. A man with a clipboard was on the phone, arranging to split them up and send them to separate facilities across the state. The youngest hadn't spoken in a year. He was barefoot, and then a black SUV pulled up, and the man who stepped out changed everything. The temperature had dropped below 20 degrees in Chicago's meatpacking district, and the wind that swept through the narrow service alley behind Kedzie Avenue carried with it the smell of diesel, rusted metal, and something worse, something human and desperate that had no name but could be felt in the bones of anyone who'd ever been abandoned. 5 children stood pressed against a crumbling brick wall. The oldest was 14. His name was Emmerich. He was bleeding from a cut above his left eye, where the back of a man's hand had connected with his orbital bone 7 minutes earlier. The blood ran warm down his temple, pooling against his jaw, and he hadn't wiped it. Not because he didn't feel it, but because both of his hands were occupied. One gripping his 11-year-old sister's wrist, the other wrapped around the collar of his 9-year-old brother's jacket, holding him upright. Behind Emmerich, pressed flat against the wall, as though she could make herself thin enough to disappear into it, was Sable, 6 years old. She was clutching a one-eyed stuffed rabbit with matted gray fur to her chest with both arms, and her lips were moving rapidly, whispering something only the rabbit could hear. She wore no coat. Her shoes were too big, borrowed from a donation bin 3 shelters ago, and the left one had lost its lace entirely. And behind Sable, tucked into the smallest space between a rusted dumpster and the wall, was Ren, 4 years old. Barefoot, silent, Ren hadn't spoken a word in 11 months, not since the night their mother didn't come home from the gas station on Pulaski Road and never came back. The doctors at Cook County said it was selective mutism. The foster intake worker wrote nonverbal in the case file and underlined it twice, as though the act of underlining could substitute for an actual diagnosis, an actual plan, an actual human being who gave a damn. Ren's eyes were open. That was the thing. They were enormous and dark and open, and they tracked everything, every shadow, every raised voice, every movement in the dark, with the precision of a creature that had learned very early that survival depended on watching. The man standing at the mouth of the alley was named Tully Strack. He was not a social worker. He had never been a social worker. What Tully Strack was, in the complex and largely invisible economy of Cook County's child welfare system, was a broker, a middleman. The kind of man who knew which group homes had vacancies, which foster parents asked no questions, which facilities upstate paid per head, and didn't require background checks on the children being delivered to them. He had a clipboard. He always had a clipboard. It gave him the appearance of officiality, which was the only currency that mattered when you were loading children into unmarked vehicles at 11 o'clock at night. "The 2 younger ones go to Rockford," Tully said into his phone, not looking at the children. Yeah, the girl and the quiet one. The middle kid. I got a family in Joliet that'll take a boy under 10 for the subsidy. The older 2," he paused, listened. "I don't care. Split them however you want. The girl's compliant. The oldest is a problem." Emmerich heard every word. He'd been hearing words like these for 3 years, since their father went to Stateville on an aggravated battery charge, and their mother started disappearing for longer and longer stretches until she disappeared permanently. Since the first caseworker said, "We'll try to keep you together," with the same tone a person uses when they say, "I'll call you back," knowing they won't. 3 years of group homes and emergency placements and kinship evaluations that went nowhere because there was no kin. 3 years of watching his siblings get separated and reunited and separated again, each time a little more broken, a little more silent, a little more convinced that the world was a machine designed to grind children into dust. Emmerich tightened his grip on Solveig's wrist. Solveig was 11. She had their mother's face, the same wide-set eyes, the same careful mouth that could smile in a way that made you think everything was fine, even when nothing was. Solveig was the one who braided Sable's hair. Solveig was the one who remembered which sibling was allergic to what. Solveig was the one who carried Ren when Ren couldn't walk anymore and sang to him in the dark and told him stories about a house they would live in someday that had a yard and a dog and a door that locked from the inside. Solveig wasn't crying. She hadn't cried in months. The machinery of grief in her had been running so long and so hard that it had simply worn itself smooth. She stood beside Emmerich, her free hand resting on Prosper's shoulder, and she watched Tully Strack with the flat, knowing gaze of a child who understood exactly what was about to happen and had already begun the internal work of surviving it. Prosper was 9. He had a stutter that worsened under stress, and right now, standing in this alley, his entire body was a single, trembling nerve. He couldn't look at Tully. He couldn't look at anyone. His eyes were fixed on the ground, on a crack in the pavement where a stubborn weed had pushed through the concrete, and he was breathing in short, hitching gasps that were almost but not quite sobs. "Please," Prosper whispered, not to anyone in particular, just into the cold. Please don't." Tully glanced at him. "Quiet," he said, the way you'd say it to a dog. Emmerich stepped forward. "We don't split." Tully lowered the phone. He looked at Emmerich, really looked at him, with the practiced assessment of a man who sorted children the way a butcher sorted cuts. Problem. Asset. Liability. Write-off. "You don't get to decide that, kid." "We don't split," Emmerich said again. His voice was steady. The blood was still running down his face, and his hands were shaking, and he was 14 years old and weighed 112 pounds, and he said it like a man delivering a verdict. Tully stepped closer. He was 6'1", 230, ex-corrections. He smelled like menthol cigarettes and something chemical. Your caseworker signed the transfer. It's done. The girls go one way, the boys go another, and you—" He jabbed a finger at Emmerich's chest. "You go wherever I say you go, and if you keep running your mouth, I'll make sure that place has a lock on the outside of the door." Emmerich didn't flinch, not because he wasn't afraid. He was terrified, but flinching was a luxury that cost things he couldn't afford to pay. Behind him, Sable pressed her face into the stuffed rabbit. Ren's eyes tracked a shadow at the end of the alley. And then the shadow moved. The black Escalade turned onto the service road with its headlights off. It idled to a stop 30 feet from the mouth of the alley, and for a long moment, nothing happened. The engine hummed. The tinted windows revealed nothing. The vehicle sat there like a held breath. Tully noticed it first. His hand drifted to his belt, not to a weapon, but to his phone, which was the closest thing to a weapon a man like Tully Strack possessed. In his world, threats were managed with calls, not calibers. But something about this vehicle, the deliberateness of its approach, the killed headlights, the absolute stillness, made him take a step back. The rear passenger door opened. The man who stepped out was 36 years old. He wore a charcoal overcoat that had been tailored in Milan and cost more than the average Chicago family earned in a month. His shoes were handmade. His watch was not visible, tucked beneath the cuff, which meant it was expensive enough not to need showing. His hair was dark, cut close, and the architecture of his face was sharp in a way that suggested his features had been built by something harder than genetics, by years of decisions that didn't allow for softness. His name was Calder Thasane. In certain circles in Chicago, circles that operated in the margins between legitimate commerce and organized violence, the name Calder Thasane carried a specific gravity that bent the behavior of everyone within its orbit. He controlled 7 of the 12 distribution corridors between O'Hare and the South Side. He held silent partnerships in 14 commercial properties along the Magnificent Mile. He had, at last count, the working loyalty of 2 aldermen, a deputy police superintendent, and a circuit court judge who was not the same circuit court judge who would later become relevant to this story, but who existed in the same compromised ecosystem. Calder Thasane was not a man who rescued people. He was a man who acquired things: territory, influence, leverage, silence, with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the world was a series of transactions and that the only meaningful currency was the ability to control what happened. Next, he was here tonight for an entirely different reason, an unremarkable meeting with a freight operator whose warehouse sat 2 blocks from this alley, regarding a shipping route that had been disrupted by a federal investigation that was getting too close to a particular port of entry. The meeting had lasted 11 minutes. The problem had been resolved with 2 phone calls and a wire transfer that would never appear on any ledger. He was leaving when he heard the voice. "We don't split." He stopped. It was not the words themselves that arrested him. It was the quality of the voice, the frequency of it, the specific note that a human voice hits when the person speaking is young and terrified and absolutely certain. The note that exists at the precise intersection of fear and defiance, where a person knows they are outmatched and outgunned and says the thing anyway because the alternative is a silence that would cost more than any beating. Calder knew that note. He had lived inside that note for the first 15 years of his life. He walked toward the alley. Not quickly. Not with urgency. With the measured, deliberate stride of a man who never rushed because rushing implied a lack of control, and a lack of control was something Calder Thesane had not permitted in himself for 21 years. Diddy, his driver, a broad, silent man named Kessler, appeared at his shoulder. "Boss, stay with the car." "Boss." The car, Kessler. Kessler stayed with the car. Calder rounded the corner of the building and stopped at the mouth of the alley. He saw everything in a single, comprehensive sweep, the way a man who has survived violence learns to see, reading a scene the way a combat veteran reads terrain. 5 children. 1 bleeding. 1 barefoot. 1 whispering to a stuffed animal. 1 trembling so hard his jacket was shaking. 1 standing like a small, fierce pillar between the man with the clipboard and the rest of the world, and the man with the clipboard, thick, sweating despite the cold, phone in one hand, the body language of someone who had just been interrupted in the middle of commerce. Calder said nothing for 4 seconds. In negotiations, he had been known to use silence the way other men used weapons, precisely, intentionally, and with the full understanding that the absence of sound could be more destabilizing than any threat. Tully turned, saw him, recognized something, not the face specifically, but the category, the coat, the posture, the way the air around this man seemed to cost money. "This doesn't concern you, friend." Calder looked at Tully Strack the way a person looks at an insect on a countertop, not with anger, not with disgust, with the calm, clinical assessment of someone determining whether to step on it now or later. Then he looked at the children. Emmerich was staring at him. Blood on his face, hands still gripping his siblings, eyes burning with the kind of intelligence that Calder recognized, because it was his own kind, the intelligence that develops in children who have been failed so completely by every system that they are forced to build their own operating logic from scratch. "Who are you?" Emmerich said. Not a challenge, a demand for information. The voice of a boy who had learned that new adults meant new dangers, and that the first question was always the same. "What do you want from us?" Calder didn't answer the question. He turned back to Tully. "How much?" Tully blinked. "What?" "The transaction you're conducting with these children. What is its value?" "Listen, pal, I don't know who you think. $1,700 per child for out-of-county placement, plus the per diem from the receiving facility." Calder said it flatly, without inflection, the way a man reads numbers from a spreadsheet. "That's the standard rate for what you do, which means you're looking at roughly $8,500 for the set, assuming the silent one doesn't get flagged as high needs, which would reduce the margin." Tully's face went the color of old milk. "I know the economics of what you are," Calder said. "I know the name of every facility you've placed children in during the last 18 months. I know who signs your authorizations at DCFS. And I know that if I make one phone call right now, not to the police because the police are not equipped to help children, but to the person who owns the professional future of your friend at the department, This conversation ends with you losing substantially more than $8,500. The silence that followed was the kind that has physical weight. Tully opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. These kids are state property. No. Calder's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the way a blade carries, clean, direct, and without effort. They're not. Leave. Tully looked at him, looked at the Escalade idling at the curb, looked at the children. Something in his small, calculating brain performed a rapid cost-benefit analysis, the kind of math that men like Tully Strack were very good at, which was the math of personal risk versus personal gain. He left. He turned and walked down the alley in the other direction, pulling his collar up, and disappeared around the corner, and the sound of his footsteps faded into the city noise, and then there was nothing in the alley except the 5 children and Calder Thesane and the cold. Calder stood in the mouth of the alley. He did not approach the children. He did not crouch down, the way well-meaning adults crouch down when they want to seem less threatening, which is a gesture children see through instantly, because it is a performance of safety rather than the presence of it. He simply stood there, and he said, "All of you, come with me." 5 pairs of eyes, 5 different calculations, 5 sets of survival instincts honed by years of evaluating strangers. Good stranger, bad stranger, same stranger, different face. Emmerich stepped forward. 1 half step. His body was positioned between Calder and the other 4, and his jaw was set, and his fists were balled at his sides, and he was shaking, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline, from the fight that was still living in his nervous system. "Who are you?" Emmerich said again. "Someone who's not going to separate you." "Everyone says that." "I know." A pause. The wind moved through the alley. Sable's whisper to the rabbit was the only sound. "We don't split," Emmerich said. One more time, testing the words against this new stranger, the way you test ice before you step on it. Calder looked at him, directly, without the performative warmth that adults deploy when they want children to cooperate, without the professional distance that caseworkers maintain when they want to process children efficiently. He looked at Emmerich with the only thing that mattered in this moment, which was the truth. "You won't." Another pause. Longer. Emmerich looked back at his siblings. Solveig gave him a look that was not agreement, and not disagreement, but something older. The look of a child who has run out of options and knows it, who understands that the choice is not between safety and danger, but between this danger and that one. Emmerich turned back to Calder. He didn't nod. He didn't agree. He simply moved. He took Prosper's hand in one of his, and Solveig's in the other, and Solveig reached back for Sable, and Sable clutched the rabbit tighter and reached for Wren, and Wren, silent, barefoot, enormous-eyed, let himself be pulled forward. They walked out of the alley in a chain. 5 children holding hands in the dark, following a stranger to an Escalade that could take them anywhere in the world, and they went because the alternative was the alley. And the alley was what they already knew, and what they already knew had never once been kind. Kessler opened the rear door. His face was professional, his eyes when they swept over. The 5 children were not. The children climbed in. They sat pressed together on the bench seat, a compressed mass of limbs and fear and warmth, and Emmerich positioned himself closest to the door with his hand on the handle, ready, always ready to run. Calder stood outside for a moment. The cold bit at his face. He looked back at the empty alley where, 10 minutes ago, 5 children were about to be parceled out to facilities across the state like inventory. Something moved inside his chest. Something tectonic. He cataloged it, filed it, and buried it beneath 21 years of practiced control. He got in the car. "Home," he said to Kessler. The Escalade pulled away from the curb. The alley disappeared behind them. The city swallowed the silence. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building on East Lake Shore Drive that had been built in 1929 and renovated in 2019 with a kind of money that doesn't ask permission from historical preservation boards. The lobby was marble. The elevator was private. The hallway leading to the residence smelled like cedar, and something architectural. The scent of spaces designed by people who understood that wealth, at its highest expression, smells like nothing at all. Calder Thassain had lived in this penthouse for 4 years. He had furnished it with the minimalism of a man who distrusted comfort as a category. The furniture was expensive and sparse. The lighting was low. The artwork on the walls was abstract in a way that demanded nothing from the viewer. No emotion, no response, no engagement of any kind. It was a space designed for one person who required nothing from his surroundings except silence and control. At 11:47 p.m., 5 children entered this space, and the silence shattered, not with noise. The children made almost no noise at all. They shattered it with their presence, with the specific, undeniable gravity of 5 small human beings who did not belong here and whose not belonging changed the molecular composition of every room they entered. Kessler held the elevator door. The children filed out in the same order they had entered the vehicle. Emmerich first, then Solveig, then Prosper, then Sable, then Wren, still holding hands, still connected in that desperate chain that was less a gesture of affection than a survival mechanism, the physical manifestation of a promise they had made to each other in a group home 2 years ago that they would never let go, no matter what. Maren Kale was waiting in the foyer. Maren was 53 years old and had been managing Calder Thassain's household for 6 years. She was Norwegian by birth, Chicago by choice, and practical in the particular way of women who have outlived several versions of themselves and have distilled their personality down to what works. She kept the penthouse spotless. She managed a staff of 4. She knew in broad strokes what Calder Thassain did for a living, and she had made her peace with it. The way a person makes their peace with weather. It existed. It could not be changed, and the best strategy was a good coat. Maren looked at the 5 children standing in the foyer of the most expensive private residence on East Lake Shore Drive and said nothing for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked at Calder. Mr. Thassain. Maren. These are children. Yes. 5 of them. Also yes. Maren's mouth thinned, not in disapproval, in rapid calculation. She was already counting bedrooms, assessing sizes for clothing, cataloging injuries. The cut on the oldest one's face, the bruised wrist on the middle boy, the bare feet on the smallest. Her mind was a machine designed for logistics, and it had just received a new and entirely unexpected assignment. "How long?" she asked. Calder removed his overcoat, hung it on the hook by the door, smoothed the cuffs of his shirt. He did these things with the deliberate, unhurried precision that was his constant signature, the body language of a man who refused to be rushed by circumstances, even when the circumstances involved 5 traumatized children standing in his foyer at midnight. "Indefinitely," he said. Maren looked at him. A long look. The kind of look that 2 people who have worked together for 6 years can exchange without words. A look that contained several complete sentences, including, "Have you lost your mind?" and "I will handle this," and "We will discuss this further when there are not 10 eyes watching us." "Bedrooms on the 3rd floor," Maren said. "I'll make them up. All 5 in one room." Maren hesitated. It was a large penthouse. There were 7 bedrooms across the upper floors. The logical arrangement. "1 room, Maren." They stayed together. She nodded. She turned. She walked toward the staircase with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had just accepted an impossible task and intended to execute it flawlessly. The children stood in the foyer. Emmerich hadn't released his grip on the door handle. Not the elevator now, but the door frame of the entrance. One hand on the wall, body angled toward the exit. Ready, even here, even in this cathedral of wealth and silence, his body was positioned for escape. Solveig was looking around the space with an expression that was not awe. It was assessment. She was reading the room the way she read every room. Exits, obstacles, hiding places, the distance between here and the nearest lockable door. She had done this in 12 different living situations. She could evaluate a space in 4 seconds. This one had 3 exits, no immediately lockable doors, and too much open floor plan. Not ideal, but not the worst. Prosper stood with his arms wrapped around his own torso, gripping his elbows, rocking slightly on his heels. His breathing was shallow, his eyes were on the floor. The stutter that lived in his throat like a trapped bird was active now. He could feel it, the way a person with a chronic condition ought to feel an episode building, and he pressed his lips together to keep it inside because the worst thing, the absolute worst thing in a new place was to speak and have the words come out broken. Sable was whispering to the rabbit. "It's okay, Mr. Pemberton. It's okay. It's a big house. Big houses can be okay. Remember the one in Evanston? That one was big too, and the lady had cookies. Maybe this one has cookies." She did not sound like she believed this. Wren stood at the end of the chain. He had not looked up since they entered the building. His eyes were on his bare feet against the marble floor, and his face was a small, closed thing, a face that had decided, at 4 years old, that the safest possible expression was no expression at all. Calder observed all of this. He did not approach them. He did not offer words of comfort. He did not attempt to establish warmth or trust or any of the social lubrications that adults typically deploy in the presence of frightened children. What he did was stand at a distance of approximately 10 feet, hands at his sides, and allow the silence to exist. He knew from a childhood he did not discuss, in a South Side neighborhood that no longer existed in its original form, in a series of placements that had taught him everything about the mathematics of survival, that frightened children do not need words. They need evidence. They need to observe over time that the space they are in does not hurt them. And that process cannot be accelerated with language. It can only be accelerated with patience. Theron Vask arrived 6 minutes later. Theron was Calder's chief lieutenant. He was 41, Haitian-American, built like a middleweight who had graduated to management, with a shaved head and eyes that missed nothing, and a mind that operated with the cold precision of a logistics algorithm. He had been with Calder for 12 years, since the early days, since the consolidation, since the period of Calder's rise that involved events neither man discussed in polite company, or for that matter, in any company at all. Theron walked into the penthouse, saw the children, and stopped. "No," he said. Calder looked at him. "Calder, no." "Theron, this is not a group home. This is not a shelter. This is the operational center of a—" He glanced at the children, lowered his voice. "Of an enterprise that cannot afford the kind of exposure that comes with. What is this? What happened?" They were being brokered. Brokered. Split and sold to facilities across the state by someone operating inside the DCFS framework. Theron's jaw tightened. He was not a man who tolerated the exploitation of children. He was, in fact, a man who had spent the first 9 years of his own life in a series of foster placements in Miami that had left him with 2 cracked ribs, a distrust of institutions, and a permanent and abiding fury at the systems that claim to protect the vulnerable while operating, in practice, as a supply chain for the worst kinds of human commerce. But his fury was separate from his professional judgment, and his professional judgment was telling him, loudly and clearly, that this was a problem. "Boss, what are they doing here?" Calder straightened his cuffs again. The gesture was automatic, a physical ritual of control that he performed when his internal landscape was more turbulent than his exterior permitted. "They're staying." Theron looked at him. For a long time. Then he looked at the children. Emmerich was watching him with the same burning, assessing gaze he turned on every new adult. Solveig had shifted her body to put herself between Theron and the younger ones. Prosper was still rocking. Sable was still whispering. Wren was still staring at his feet. Theron exhaled. It was not a sigh. It was the sound of a man realigning his entire operational framework in real time. "I'll increase the security rotation," he said, "and I'll need to talk to Cassius, meow, about the legal exposure." "In the morning?" "In the morning," Theron agreed. He turned to leave. At the door, he paused. Without turning around, he said, "The little one needs shoes." "I know." Theron left. Marin had prepared the largest guest room on the 3rd floor with military efficiency. 5 bedding sets laid out on a king-size bed and 2 additional mattresses she had pulled from storage. Pillows, more pillows than 5 children knew what to do with. Clean towels, a nightlight plugged into the baseboard outlet, because Marin understood, without being told, that children who have lived in institutional settings need light in the dark. Solveig was the first to notice the nightlight. Her hand, the one not holding Sable's, twitched slightly. She said nothing, but something in her shoulders, which had been locked at a rigid 45 degrees since the alley, dropped by approximately 1 centimeter. It was the first relaxation any of them had shown. Marin stood in the doorway. There are extra blankets in the closet. The bathroom is through that door. There is a lock on the bathroom door. She said this last part with deliberate emphasis, looking at Solveig, because Marin understood that 11-year-old girls in strange houses needed to know about locks. Solveig nodded. A micro nod, barely visible. "Are you hungry?" Marin asked. No one answered. Emmerich's eyes flicked to his siblings and back to Marin. In the lexicon of survival, this question was a test. Saying yes meant vulnerability. Saying no meant going hungry. Emmerich had been making this calculation for years, decades in emotional time, and the answer was always the same. Deny need, minimize exposure, ask for nothing. "I'll put sandwiches in the kitchen," Marin said, reading the silence perfectly. "In case anyone gets hungry later." She didn't wait for a response. She walked away down the hall, and her footsteps receded, and the children were alone. They moved into the room as a unit. Emmerich checked the window. Locked, 3rd floor, no viable exit, but also no viable entry. He checked the closet, empty, except for blankets. He checked the bathroom, clean, functional, and yes, a lock on the door. He checked under the bed because checking under the bed was a reflex that had been installed in him by a foster placement in Waukegan, where the man in the house would wait in dark places for children who wandered at night. When the room had been declared safe, a process that took Emmerich approximately 90 seconds and was as methodical as a military sweep, the chain loosened. Solveig sat on the edge of the bed. She pulled Sable into her lap. Sable pressed her face into Solveig's shoulder and went silent for the first time. No whispering, no narration to the rabbit. Just the quiet of a child who had found a body she trusted enough to stop talking. Prosper sat on the mattress on the floor. He pulled his knees to his chest and pressed his forehead against them, and his body continued its quiet, rhythmic rocking, and he breathed, and he breathed, and he breathed. Ren stood in the center of the room. He stood there the way a plant stands, rooted, silent, oriented toward nothing. His bare feet on the carpet, his eyes open, his face empty. Emmerich watched his siblings settle. He did not settle. He stood by the door, one hand on the frame, positioned exactly where he had been in the foyer and in the alley and in every room he had entered for the last 3 years. At the threshold, facing out, standing guard. He did not sleep. At 2:14 a.m., one of the children came downstairs. Calder was sitting in the study on the 2nd floor. He had not gone to bed. He was seated in the leather chair by the window, looking out at the black plain of Lake Michigan. And he was thinking about a night in 1997 when he was 7 years old and had hidden in a bathroom in a house on Cottage Grove Avenue, while a man who was not his father but who occupied the same household broke things in the kitchen with methodical, drunken precision. He did not think about that night often. He had, over the course of 29 years, built an architecture of control over his own memory that was as sophisticated and impenetrable as the organizational structure of his business. But tonight, the alley, the children, the chain of hands in the dark had found a crack in that architecture, and the memory had slipped through. He heard the footsteps. Light. Tentative. The footsteps of a small person navigating an unfamiliar space in the dark. He didn't move. He waited. The kitchen light turned on, a thin strip of it visible from the study. The sound of a cabinet opening, closing, a drawer, the rustle of something being wrapped carefully. Calder rose silently and walked to the doorway of the kitchen. Solveig was standing at the counter. She had found the sandwiches Maren had left, 4 of them, neatly wrapped in wax paper, arranged on a plate. Solveig had taken 2 of them. She had not eaten them. She was wrapping them tighter, more securely, with the compulsive precision of a person who has learned to stockpile food because the next meal is never guaranteed. She was hiding bread in her pockets. She saw Calder in the doorway and froze. Her hands stopped moving. Her eyes, their mother's eyes, wide and watchful, locked on him with the specific fear of a child caught doing something she knows is wrong but cannot stop doing because the survival instinct that drives it is older and stronger than any rule. "Sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I'll put them back." Calder looked at the sandwiches in her hands. He looked at the 2 remaining on the plate. He looked at the pockets of her too large jacket, which already had a familiar bulge. She had done this before, in other kitchens, in other houses, always preparing for the inevitable moment when the food would stop. "Take all 4, he said. Solveig stared at him. "And there's more in the refrigerator. Anything in the kitchen is available to you. At any time." He said this without warmth, without the soft, coaxing tone that adults use when they want children to feel safe. He said it as a statement of fact. Flat, direct, and absolute, because he understood from the deepest and most unreachable part of his own experience that a child who hoards food does not need reassurance. A child who hoards food needs certainty. And certainty is not delivered through tone. It is delivered through repetition and consistency and the slow, grinding accumulation of evidence that the words match the reality. Solveig stood there for a long moment, the sandwiches in her hands, the kitchen light humming above her, the lake outside the window, black and vast and indifferent. She took all 4 sandwiches. She wrapped them carefully. She put 2 in her pockets and carried 2 against her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she was gone, her footsteps padding up the stairs, and the kitchen was empty again, and Calder stood in the doorway and felt something shift inside him, some deep, load-bearing structure that had held for 21 years, adjusting by a fraction of a degree. He returned to the study. He sat in the chair. He looked at the lake. He did not sleep either. The first morning was a study in silence. Maren arrived at 7 a.m. with 3 bags of children's clothing purchased from a 24-hour Target on State Street, the only store open at 5 in the morning when she had driven there, still in her coat from the night before, with a list she had compiled from visual estimation alone. She was accurate to within 1 size for all 5 children, which was, in Maren's private estimation, an acceptable margin of error. She laid the clothes out in the 3rd-floor hallway, folded, organized by size. She did not enter the room. She knocked once, a single, clear knock that announced presence without demanding entry, and said through the door, "Clothes are in the hall. Breakfast will be ready in 30 minutes. Inside the room, Emmerich was already awake. He had been awake all night. He stood by the door, listening to the knock, listening to the footsteps retreat. And then he opened the door 1 inch, just enough to see the hallway, confirm it was empty, and pull the clothes inside. He sorted them himself, gave Solveig the girls' clothes, laid out Prosper's, checked the tags on the shoes, a pair of small white sneakers that were, by some miracle of Maren's estimation, exactly Wren's size. He put the shoes on Wren himself, kneeling on the carpet, threading the laces through the eyelets, with fingers that were clumsy from exhaustion and adrenaline, tying them the way he had tied them 1,000 times before, double knots because Wren couldn't retie them, and loose shoes meant slow running, and slow running meant not getting away. Wren watched the shoe-tying process with his enormous, unblinking eyes. He did not resist. He did not help. He was a passenger in his own body, a witness to his own existence, and the shoes appeared on his feet, the way all things appeared in Wren's world, without his participation, without his consent, and without comment. Breakfast was eggs, toast, orange juice, fruit sliced into small pieces. Maren had prepared it with the institutional efficiency of a woman who understood that the first meal in a new place was not about nutrition. It was about establishing a pattern. Meals happen here. Food appears here. This is a place where people eat. The children came to the table in formation. Emmerich first, scanning. Solveig next, guiding Prosper by the shoulder. Sable with the rabbit. Wren at the end. They sat. They did not eat. Not immediately. There was a pause, a held breath that lasted approximately 45 seconds, during which each child performed their own private assessment of the situation. Was the food safe? Was eating here a transactional act that would incur a debt? Was this the kind of place where eating meant you owed something, where the food was a leash, where accepting nourishment meant accepting obligation? Sable broke first. She reached for a piece of toast, tore it in half, and gave one half to the rabbit. "Mr. Pemberton says thank you," she said to no one in particular. Prosper ate next, quickly, silently, with the mechanical efficiency of a boy who had learned to eat fast because food could be taken away. Solveig ate slowly, watching. Her eyes moved between the kitchen and the hallway, and the windows and back, mapping the environment while she chewed, filing information, building the mental model of this new place that she would need in order to navigate it safely. Wren did not eat. He sat in his chair, his new shoes touching the floor, his hands in his lap, and he stared at the plate as though it were a problem he had not been given the tools to solve. Emmerich did not eat either. He stood by the door of the kitchen, watching his siblings, watching the hallway. Waiting, Calder entered the kitchen at 7:38 a.m. He was dressed for the day. Dark shirt, dark trousers, shoes that cost more than the monthly foster stipend for all 5 children combined. He paused in the doorway, registered the scene. The 4 children at the table, the one standing guard. He poured himself a cup of coffee. Black. No sugar. He leaned against the counter, 10 feet from the table, and drank it in silence. He did not greet the children. He did not ask how they slept. He did not perform any of the social rituals that adults typically enact in the morning. He simply existed in the space, present, visible, and unremarkable, and allowed the children to observe him the way they needed to observe him, which was at a distance, without pressure, and for as long as they required. This was a strategy. Not a warm one. Not an intuitive one. It was the product of Calder Thessane's own childhood, which had taught him that the most dangerous adults were the ones who tried hardest to be liked, the ones who came at you with smiles and questions and an aggressive, suffocating friendliness that was in reality a demand that you perform gratitude, perform comfort, perform the role of the saved child so that the saving adult could feel good about themselves. Calder had no interest in feeling good about himself. He had an interest in not separating 5 children. Beyond that, his motives were, even to himself, unclear. And he was fine with that. He was a man who had built an empire on incomplete information, and he trusted the process of waiting for clarity more than he trusted the process of manufacturing it. Theron arrived at 8:15 with Cassius Brine. Cassius was Calder's attorney. He was 58, silver-haired, and possessed of the kind of legal mind that operated in the space between what was lawful and what was possible, which was a larger space than most people imagined. He had been managing the legal architecture of Calder's enterprises for 9 years. He had never in those 9 years been asked to manage a situation involving 5 minor children. "This is irregular," Cassius said, which was the legal equivalent of saying the building was on fire. "Understood. The state of Illinois has specific protocols regarding the custody and placement of minors in the DCFS system. You cannot simply acquire children, Calder. They were being trafficked within the system. That's a claim that would require evidence and a legal proceeding to establish. In the meantime, you are, technically, in violation of..." "In the meantime," Calder said, "they have shoes and a meal and a bed where all 5 of them are in the same room. What does the state have to offer that improves on that?" Cassius was silent for a moment. He was a man who valued precision. He was also a man who had 3 grandchildren and who understood, beneath the carapace of legal expertise, that the law and justice were not always the same animal. "I'll file for emergency guardianship," he said. "I'll need their full names, dates of birth, and current case numbers. And I need you to understand that this filing will draw attention. The kind of attention that your other interests would prefer to avoid. File it." Calder. "File it, Cassius." Cassius filed it. The first 3 days moved with the slow, grinding weight of geological time. Each day was a series of small observations, small gestures, small shifts in the tectonic plates of trust that would, eventually, either move towards something or pull apart completely. On the first day, Emmerich did not leave the 3rd floor. He stationed himself in the hallway outside the bedroom, back against the wall, and he watched every person who moved through the house. Marin, the cleaning staff, a delivery person who brought groceries, Kessler, who moved through the penthouse like a shadow with a shoulder holster. Emmerich catalogued each of them. Threat, assessment, behavioral patterns, distance from the children. On the 2nd day, Prosper had a panic attack in the bathroom. Solveig heard it through the door, the hyperventilating, the soft, stuttered pleas of, sit, stop, please sit, stop." And she sat on the other side of the door and pressed her palm flat against the wood and said, very quietly, "I'm here, I'm right here, I'm not going anywhere." She said it for 11 minutes until his breathing slowed. Calder was on the 2nd floor. He heard everything through the vent that connected the 3rd floor bathroom to the 2nd floor study. He did not go upstairs. He understood that going upstairs, inserting himself into a crisis he had not been invited into, would accomplish nothing except demonstrating to Emmerich that adults in this house moved toward children during moments of vulnerability, which was exactly the pattern that had preceded the worst experiences of their lives. On the 3rd day, something happened that was very small and very large at the same time. Sable was in the living room. She was sitting on the floor with Mr. Pemberton in her lap, conducting what appeared to be a medical examination of the rabbit. The rabbit's remaining eye was loose, and Sable was attempting to resecure it with a piece of tape she had found somewhere, and she was narrating the procedure in the earnest, detailed tone of a 6-year-old who has absorbed the language of doctors' offices from too many visits to too many clinics. "You're going to be fine, Mr. Pemberton. This is just a regular checkup. The doctor says your eye is fine. It just needs a little tape. Everyone needs tape sometimes." Calder walked through the living room on his way to a meeting in the study. He paused, not deliberately. His feet simply stopped, the way a person's feet stop when they encounter something that doesn't fit into the expected pattern of their environment. He looked at the rabbit, the loose eye, the matted fur, the tape that was not holding. He left the room. 20 minutes later, he returned. He placed a small, white tag on the table beside Sable, the kind of tag you would find on a piece of luggage. On it, in Calder's precise architectural handwriting, was a single word. Pemberton. Sable picked it up. She looked at it. She looked at Calder, who was already leaving the room, his back to her, heading toward the study. She looked at the rabbit. She tied the name tag to Mr. Pemberton's left ear with the piece of tape she had been using for the eye, and something in her face, some small, bright thing that had been flickering uncertainly for months, steadied. "He knows your name," she whispered to the rabbit. "He knows your name." No one else in the room heard her, but the thing she was saying was true, and the truth of it was larger than the words. And the fact that a man who ran a criminal empire in the city of Chicago had taken 30 seconds out of his day to write a name on a luggage tag for a one-eyed stuffed rabbit was, well, it was the beginning of something. The emergency guardianship filing landed on the desk of Judge Harwick Crane on a Tuesday morning. Judge Crane was 61 years old, a lifelong resident of Cook County, and a man whose career on the family court bench had been characterized by 2 things: an impeccable public reputation for advocating child welfare and a private relationship with the operators of 17 group homes and residential treatment facilities across Illinois that was transactional in a way that would have ended his career if it had ever been documented. Harwick Crane was not evil in the way that people imagine evil, not mustache-twirling, not cackling, not possessed of a self-aware malice. He was evil in the way that most evil actually manifests in the world, which is through the slow, incremental corruption of a person who began with good intentions and gradually discovered that the system rewarded the wrong things. He had started his career as a genuine advocate. He had, over the course of 30 years, become the system he had once fought against. He read the filing. He read the name, Calder Thasane. He picked up the phone. Delphine Royce answered on the second ring. She was 44, a senior administrator at the Department of Children and Family Services, and she had the specific energy of a bureaucrat who had been promoted beyond her competence and compensated for the deficit by becoming territorial, obstructionist, and deeply suspicious of anyone who attempted to work outside her control. "I need the file on the Vasiliev children," Crane said. "Which Vasiliev?" "Oh, the 5-pack. Don't call them that. It's what the caseworkers call them. 5 siblings, same placement requirement. It's a logistical nightmare. Nobody wants all 5. Someone does, apparently." He told her about the filing. She listened. The silence on the other end of the phone had a texture, the specific textures of a person calculating exposure. "Thasane," she said. That's a name. It's a problem." "How so?" "Because if he files for guardianship, and his lawyers are competent, and they are, they're going to pull the placement history for those children. All of it. Every transfer, every facility, every authorization, and some of those authorizations have your signature on them, Delphine." The silence thickened. "I need those children back in the system," Crane said. "Preferably distributed across separate facilities, preferably before Thasane's filing gets a hearing date." "And if the children don't want to go?" "The children are minors. They don't get a vote." Lazaro Moret was the other problem. Lazaro ran the North Side. He was 52, Sicilian by heritage, and possessed of the old-school sensibility that regarded the territories of organized crime in Chicago the way feudal lords regarded their holdings, as fixed, sacred, and defended to the death. He and Calder had maintained a working detente for 6 years, based on mutual recognition of boundaries and a shared understanding that open conflict was bad for business. The detente had been fraying. There were 4 shipping routes through the Great Lakes corridor that both organizations needed access to, and the negotiation over those routes had been in a slow-burn stalemate for 8 months. Lazaro was looking for leverage. Calder had, until recently, been an extraordinarily difficult man to leverage because he had no attachments, no family, no romantic relationships, no visible human connections that could be exploited. 5 children changed that calculation. Theron brought the intelligence report to Calder's study on Thursday afternoon, 4 days after the alley. "Lazaro knows." Calder looked up from a document he was reviewing. "Knows what?" "About the children. He's been asking questions through back channels. Who they are, what your relationship is, why they're here, and he's interpreting it as a vulnerability. His exact words to his underboss were, 'The man who has nothing to lose just found something to lose.'" Calder was quiet. Outside the window, the lake was a flat, gray plate under a flat, gray sky. Chicago in November. The city looked like it had been drained of color and left to dry. "He's wrong," Calder said. "Is he?" Calder didn't answer. Theron waited. The silence between them was comfortable, the silence of 2 men who had spent 12 years in each other's company and had long ago abandoned the need to fill dead air with words. "What's the timeline?" Calder asked. "Crane filed a motion to vacate your guardianship petition this morning. Hearing is set for next Tuesday. That gives us 5 days to prepare a legal defense that will need to withstand scrutiny from a judge who is actively working to undermine it. And Lazaro?" Theron paused. "Lazaro sent a man to photograph the building, yesterday, from a car parked across the Tuwa street. Just photographs. For now. Increase the rotation. 4 men on the building. 2 on the street. One in the lobby. Done. But Calder, Theron leaned forward. I need to say something and I need you to hear it. Say it. Keeping these children makes you vulnerable. The legal exposure alone is enough to justify a federal inquiry. If Crane coordinates with the U.S. attorney, and he has the connections to do it, your legitimate holdings could be frozen, your corporate structures could be audited, and if Lazaro decides to escalate while you're distracted by a custody hearing. Theron. The operational risk is Theron. Theron stopped. I hear you, Calder said. I understand the math, I understand the exposure, and I am telling you, as I have told you before, about other decisions that looked irrational and turned out to be correct, that this is not a negotiable position. Why? It was the first time in 12 years that Theron had asked Calder, why? Not how, not when, not what's the play, why? Calder looked at his lieutenant, then he looked out the window at the lake, and he said something he had never said to Theron, or to anyone, in 21 years. Because I was the oldest. The room went very still. I was the oldest, Calder repeated. And there were 3 of us, and they split us, and I couldn't stop it, and I have not. He paused, breathed, resumed with the same controlled tone, but beneath it, something was shaking. I have not seen my brother or my sister since I was 15 years old. I don't know where they are. I don't know if they're alive, and I have built everything I have, every dollar, every alliance, every piece of territory, on the back of that failure, on the promise I made to myself that the thing that was done to me would not define what I was capable of doing. He turned back to Theron. I will not watch it happen again, not in front of me, not when I have the power to stop it. Theron held his gaze. Nodded. Once. The kind of nod that doesn't mean agreement. It means recognition. It means I see you. It means I understand now what I didn't understand before, and I will not ask again. Tuesday, Theron said. We'll be ready. On Friday, 5 days after the alley, Emmerich came to find Calder. This was, in itself, extraordinary. In the 5 days since their arrival, Emmerich had not voluntarily initiated a single interaction with any adult in the house. He had responded to direct questions with monosyllables. He had accepted meals silently. He had maintained his post by the door, his position by the exit, his constant, exhausting vigilance, and he had given nothing. Not a word more than necessary. Not a gesture of trust. Not a single crack in the armor he had spent 3 years welding shut. But on Friday evening, at approximately 7:30 p.m., Emmerich walked into the study, where Calder sat reviewing documents and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and his eyes, those burning, intelligent, unbearably young eyes, locked on Calder with an intensity that was almost physical. I need to talk to you, he said. Calder set down the document. Sit. Emmerich didn't sit. He stood in the doorway. Arms crossed, shoulders rigid, every muscle in his body coiled with the tension of a person who is about to do something difficult and cannot be sure of the outcome. The hearing, he said. Tuesday, I know about it. Calder watched him, said nothing, let the boy speak. Salve heard your lawyer on the phone. She told me. She tells me everything. A pause. The judge wants to take us back, put us in the system, split us up. That's what the judge wants. It's not what's going to happen. You don't know that. No, but I intend it. Emmerich's jaw worked. Something was building behind his eyes, a pressure, a heat, the accumulation of 5 days of restraint, and 3 years of rage, and 14 years of being a child in a world that treated children as problems to be managed rather than people to be protected. If I leave, Emmerich said, they can stay. Calder went very still. I'm the problem, Emmerich continued. I'm the one with the record. The fights, the runaways, the incident in Waukegan. The judge can use me to justify pulling the petition. But if I'm not in the picture, the other 4, they're young enough. They're compliant enough. The system can place them. You could. His voice cracked. Hairline fracture. He sealed it immediately. You could keep them without me. The room was quiet except for the sound of the wind against the window and the distant hum of the city below. Calder stood. He walked around the desk. He stopped 3 feet from Emmerich, close enough to be present, far enough to not crowd. He looked at this boy, this 14-year-old boy who had been bleeding in an alley 6 days ago, who had positioned his body between his siblings and the world every single day for 3 years, who was standing here now, offering to sacrifice himself, to remove himself from the only situation that had ever, in his entire life, not split them up, because he believed, with the terrible logic of a child who has been failed by every adult he has ever known, that his presence was the liability. "No," Calder said. "Listen, I said no. If you would just—" "Emmerich," the boy stopped, his name, spoken in that voice, by that man, with that particular weight, hit him like a hand on the shoulder, not violent, not controlling, just present, just enough to break the momentum of his self-erasure. "No one is splitting," Calder said. "Not the 4 of them. Not you, all of you. That is not a conditional offer. It was not conditional in the alley, and it is not conditional now." Emmerich stared at him. His arms were still crossed. His jaw was still tight, but something in his posture, some degree of tension, some fraction of the rigidity that held him upright like a soldier, trembled. "Everyone says that," he whispered, the same words he had said in the alley. But this time the tone was different. This time it wasn't a challenge. It was a plea to be wrong, a plea for this time to be the time that the words meant what they said. "I know," Calder said, "and I know that you have no reason to believe me, and I know that believing me is a risk, because every adult who has ever asked you to trust them has used that trust against you. But I am asking you to take the risk, not because I've earned it, because the alternative is you walking away from your siblings, and I don't think that's what you want to do." Emmerich's eyes were wet. He blinked, hard, the blink of a boy who absolutely, categorically, under no circumstances, would allow himself to cry in front of a stranger. "Well, I can't lose them," he said. And his voice, on this sentence, was not the voice of a 14-year-old boy. It was the voice of a parent. It was the voice of every person who has ever loved someone more than they loved their own survival, and who has felt that love pressing against the walls of their chest like something trying to escape. "You won't," Calder said, and Emmerich, for the first time in 5 days, for the first time in years, for the first time in his small, brutal, magnificent life, uncrossed his arms. The days between Friday and Tuesday were the days when the ice began to move, not visibly, not dramatically. The transformations that occurred in the Thessane penthouse during those 4 days were as subtle and incremental as the movement of glaciers, invisible to the casual observer, seismic in their implications. But for the 5 children who had spent years in the frozen landscape of institutional care, even the smallest thaw was revolutionary. Saturday. Prosper spoke at breakfast. It was a single sentence. "Can I have more juice?" And it was directed at Marin. And the stutter was there, the hesitation was there, the full body flinch that accompanied the act of asking an adult for something was there. But the words came out. They left his mouth and entered the air and reached another human being. And Marin poured the juice without comment, without pause, without the particular expression of pity or impatience that Prosper had learned to expect from adults when his words didn't come smoothly. "Of course," she said, and placed the glass in front of him. Prosper looked at the glass. At Marin. At the glass again. And the corner of his mouth, just the left corner, just a twitch, so brief and so small that you would have missed it if you hadn't been watching, moved upward. It was not a smile. Not yet. But it was the place where a smile would eventually live. Saturday afternoon. Sable's voice, rising from the living room in a sustained, one-sided conversation. "Mr. Pemberton, we need to discuss the situation. I know you're worried. I'm a little worried too." But the tall man, the one with the nice shoes, he said we can stay. He didn't say for how long, but he said it, and he's not a yeller. I can tell because yellers have a face. You know the face. This man doesn't have the face. A pause, as though the rabbit had responded. I know you think all tall men have the face. But Mr. Pemberton, some tall men are just tall. That's not a crime. From the study on the second floor, Calder heard this through the vent. He did not react. He continued working, but somewhere in the deep architecture of his internal landscape, a door that had been sealed for 21 years was developing a hairline crack. Ace Sunday. Wren did something extraordinary. He was sitting on the floor of the living room in the patch of November's sunlight that fell through the floor-to-ceiling windows between 10 and 11 a.m. He was sitting with his knees drawn up and his arms wrapped around them in the compact, self-contained posture that was his default state, the posture of a child who had made himself as small as possible and intended to remain that way. Calder walked through the room, on his way somewhere, not stopping, and Wren hummed one note. A single, sustained tone that vibrated in the air for approximately 3 seconds and then disappeared. It was not a melody. It was not a word. It was the smallest possible unit of vocalization, a sound so quiet and so brief that it could have been a breath, could have been the wind, could have been anything at all. But it was a hum. Calder stopped. He turned. He looked at Wren. Wren was looking back at him. The first time in the 6 days since the alley, that Wren had voluntarily directed his gaze at another human being who was not one of his siblings. His enormous eyes, dark and serious, and containing depths that no 4-year-old should possess, locked onto Calder's face with an intensity that was almost unbearable. Then Wren looked away, back at the sunlight, back into his silence. Calder stood there for a moment. Then he continued walking. He did not comment on the hum. He did not draw attention to it. He understood, with the bone-deep understanding of a man who had once been a silent child himself, that a hum is not an invitation for a conversation. It is a test, a probe, the quietest possible way of asking, is it safe to make sound here? The answer had to be demonstrated, not spoken. Sunday evening, Solveig found Calder in the kitchen. She approached the way she approached everything, carefully, with her weight on the balls of her feet, ready to retreat. She stood 4 feet away and said, without preamble, "Wren needs a blanket. There are blankets in the closet. Not a regular blanket. His blanket. It was—" She stopped, reorganized, started again with the precision of a child who has learned to make requests efficiently because long requests get interrupted. He had a blanket, yellow, with stars on it. It was our mom's, from before. It's in the last group home we were at, Pilsen. If it's still there. Calder looked at her. The name of the facility. Bridgeway Residential, on 18th Street. And the blanket is yellow with stars. It's small, more like a receiving blanket from the hospital when he was born. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. He can sleep without it. He's been sleeping without it for 2 months, but She swallowed. He used to hold it when he still talked. Calder said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he picked up his phone, dialed, and said into it, "Kessler, I need you to retrieve something from a residential facility called Bridgeway on 18th Street in Pilsen. It's a small yellow blanket with stars. You'll find it in the belongings of a child named Wren Vasiliev. Bring it here tonight." He hung up, looked at Solveig. "Is there anything else they need?" Solveig stared at him. This was not how adults worked. In Solveig's experience, which was vast and terrible and entirely sufficient for an 11-year-old to have built a comprehensive theory of adult behavior, requests were met with conditions. "You can have this if you do that. We'll try to get that for you," which meant no. "I'll look into it," which meant never. An adult who simply picked up a phone and dispatched a person to retrieve a yellow blanket from a group home in Pilsen at 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening was an anomaly so profound that Solveig's internal model of the world could not immediately accommodate it. "You mean it," she said, not a question. I generally do." Solveig looked at him for a long time, and then she did something she hadn't done in months. She asked for something else. "Prosper likes to draw. He used to draw all the time. He stopped when—" She paused. "He just stopped. But if there were pencils and paper, maybe I'll have Maren get supplies tomorrow. And Emmerich reads. He likes books about space astronomy. He wanted to be an astronaut when he was little. Before, she stopped again. Before covered a lot of territory. Anything else? Sable needs new batteries for her nightlight. The one she brought, it's shaped like a... I'll handle it. Solveig nodded. She turned to leave. At the door, she stopped. She didn't turn around. Why are you doing this? Calder considered the question. He considered lying. He considered a sanitized version that would be appropriate for an 11-year-old. He decided, as he decided most things, that the truth was more efficient than its alternatives. Because someone should have done it for me, he said, and no one did. Solveig's shoulders rose slightly, then fell. She walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs, and Calder stood in the silence she left behind, and the crack in the door inside him widened by another fraction. The yellow blanket arrived at 9:17 p.m. Kessler brought it to the penthouse himself. It was small, smaller than Calder had imagined. Faded from washing. The stars on it were barely visible, more suggestion than pattern. It smelled like institutional detergent and something else, something older, something that might have been a woman's perfume, or might have been a memory of a woman's perfume. Solveig took it. She carried it to the third-floor bedroom. She placed it beside Ren, who was lying on the mattress with his eyes closed. Oh, but his body rigid, not sleeping, just performing the physical posture of sleep, because that was what was expected at night. She placed the blanket in his hands. Ren's fingers closed around it, instantly, the way a plant closes around sunlight. His entire body changed. The rigidity dissolved. The muscles in his face softened. The set of his jaw released, and he pulled the blanket to his chest and curled around it like a comma, and for the first time in 11 months, the shape of his body was not defensive. She found Calder still in, the kitchen. He's holding it, she said. Calder nodded. Solveig stood in the doorway, looking at this man. This strange, quiet, wealthy, dangerous man who had walked into an alley 6 days ago and changed the shape of everything. She was 11 years old, and she had already learned that the world was a place where promises meant nothing, and where the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones most likely to destroy you. She had built a wall around herself and her siblings that was made of pragmatism and distrust and the absolute refusal to need anyone outside the chain of 5. And she was standing in the doorway of a kitchen in a penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, watching a man who had just sent a driver across the city to retrieve a faded yellow blanket for a mute 4-year-old. And the wall, her wall, the wall she had spent years constructing, had a crack in it. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time any of the 5 children had said thank you to Calder. Thesane. He nodded, once, and the weight of those 2 words, thank you, spoken by an 11-year-old girl, with her mother's eyes and her own unbreakable spine, settled into his chest, like a stone dropped into deep water. Tuesday arrived with the flat, gray authority of a Chicago November morning that has no intention of being kind. The hearing was at the Daily Center. Judge Crane's courtroom. 2nd floor. Family division. Cassius Brine had spent 4 days building a case. He had filed 12 motions. He had deposed 2 former caseworkers. He had obtained, through channels that were not entirely official, the internal DCFS audit trail for the Vasiliev children, a document that showed 11 placements in 3 years, 4 of which had been flagged for investigation, and none of which had been investigated, and 3 of which led directly to facilities associated with Tully Strack's network. He had also obtained something else, a sworn affidavit from a former DCFS case supervisor who had been terminated 6 months earlier for raising concerns about the Vasiliev placement chain. The affidavit described in precise and devastating detail the financial relationship between certain DCFS administrators and certain private placement facilities, and it named names. One of those names was Delphine Royce. "This is a bomb," Cassius told Calder on Monday evening. "If we detonate it in open court, it doesn't just win the hearing. It opens a federal investigation." Good. Not good. A federal investigation into DCFS corruption will inevitably expand. Investigators will look at everyone involved, including the person who removed the children from the system in the first place, which is you. I understand. Do you? Because the exposure here. Cassius. Calder's voice was even, measured. Present the affidavit. Win the hearing. Whatever comes after, I'll manage. You're willing to risk? I'm willing to risk whatever the hearing requires me to... Risk? Cassius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the careful formality of a man who is stepping outside his professional role, "You care about these children." It was not a question. Calder didn't answer, which was, for a man like Calder Thasane, the most honest answer possible. The children were brought to the courthouse by Marin and Kessler. Calder arrived separately. Theron arrived with 4 men positioned at the building's entrances, visible enough to deter, invisible enough not to provoke. In the car on the way to the Daily Center, the children were silent. Emmerich sat in the front seat, next to Kessler. The other 4 were in the back. Solveig had Wren in her lap. Sable was whispering to Mr. Pemberton. Prosper was doing his breathing, the slow, counted breaths that Solveig had taught him for moments when the world became too loud. "Emmerich," Solveig said from the back seat. He didn't turn. "Yeah. Whatever happens in there. I know. We don't split." "I know, Sol." She was quiet. Then, he said it in the alley, and he said it again in the study. "I know. Do you believe him?" Emmerich was quiet for a long time. The car moved through traffic. The Daily Center appeared through the windshield, massive and brutalist, a building that looked like it had been designed to intimidate. "I'm trying to," Emmerich said. And the honesty in those 4 words was more than he had offered any adult in 3 years. The courtroom was not full. Family court hearings are not spectacles. They are administrative proceedings that determine the fate of children with the bureaucratic efficiency of a Department of Motor Vehicles processing license renewals. But this courtroom had more people in it than usual. Calder was seated at the petitioner's table with Cassius. He wore a dark suit, no tie. His face was composed in the expression it always wore, controlled, attentive, revealing nothing. But his hands beneath the table were pressed flat against his thighs, a gesture of restraint. A gesture that Emmerich, seated in the gallery behind him, recognized immediately, because it was the same gesture Emmerich made when he was trying not to lose control. Judge Crane entered. He was tall, silver-haired, imposing in his robes, in the way that all judges are imposing in their robes, which is the way a costume designed to represent authority represents authority regardless of the character of the person wearing it. He called the case, read the docket number, summarized the petition, emergency guardianship application, filed by Calder Thasane on behalf of the minor children, Emmerich, Solveig, Prosper, Sable, and Wren Vasiliev. "Mr. Brine," Crane said, "your petition." Cassius stood. He buttoned his jacket, and he began. He was good. He was very good. In 60 years of life and 35 years of law, Cassius Brine had developed the particular skill of presenting information in a way that was simultaneously dry enough for legal consumption and devastating enough for moral impact. He laid out the facts: 5 siblings, ages 4 through 14, 11 placements in 3 years, 4 flagged, none investigated, 3 connected to a network of for-profit facilities with documented ties to a DCFS administrator. He did not mention Delphine Royce by name. Not yet. He laid the groundwork, the pattern, the numbers, the systemic failure, and let the implication build. Crane listened. His face was impassive. His pen moved across a notepad. He was, Cassius noted, writing nothing of substance. The pen was moving for appearance only. The state's attorney, a young woman named Tessa Holt, who had been assigned this case 48 hours ago and who was, Cassius suspected, entirely unaware of the deeper politics at play, presented the counter-argument. Mr. Thasane was not a licensed foster parent. He had no formal relationship with the children. His background had not been evaluated by DCFS. The appropriate course of action was to return the children to state custody, pending a full investigation of the petitioner's suitability. It was competent. It was procedurally correct. It was also, in Cassius's estimation, completely insufficient for what was about to happen. "Your Honor," Cassius said, rising again, "the petitioner would like to introduce Exhibit 7. The affidavit." He handed copies to the clerk, to the state's attorney, and to the judge, and then he read it into the record, every word. The names, the dates, the dollar amounts, the facilities, the per-child payments, the signature of a DCFS administrator who had approved 37 out-of-county transfers in 18 months, each one to a facility that paid a referral fee to a company whose registered agent was— "Your Honor," Tessa Holt said, standing abruptly, This is not relevant to the guardianship petition." "It is directly relevant," Cassius said, without raising his voice, without breaking stride, with the calm precision of a surgeon who has planned every cut, because it establishes that the system to which the state proposes returning these children is the same system that has spent 3 years failing them. The same system that authorized the transaction my client interrupted in an alley on Kedzie Avenue 11 days ago. The courtroom was silent. Crane's pen had stopped moving. In the gallery, Emmerich was gripping the edge of the bench with both hands. Solveig had Wren in her lap, and her face was pale, and her eyes were fixed on the judge with an expression that was not hope and not fear, but something in between. The expression of a person watching a coin in the air. Crane cleared his throat. "Mr. Brine, the court appreciates the thoroughness of your filing, but this hearing concerns a guardianship petition, not a systemic audit of—" "Respectfully, Your Honor," Cassius said, "this hearing concerns the safety of 5 children, and the evidence before this court establishes that the system currently charged with ensuring that safety has been, for at least 18 months, actively participating in their endangerment." He paused. "Let it sit. My client is not asking this court to approve an irregular arrangement. He is asking this court to recognize that the regular arrangement has failed, 11 times documented, and that these 5 children—" He turned briefly to look at them in the gallery. Emmerich, rigid. Solveig, fierce. Prosper, trembling. Sable, clutching Mr. Pemberton. Wren, silent, wrapped in his yellow blanket. Deserve something better than a 12th failure. The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms. Crane sat behind his bench and felt the ground shifting beneath him. The affidavit was public record now. Read into the transcript. It couldn't be buried. It couldn't be managed. It was out, and it contained enough information to trigger an investigation that would, inevitably, reach the people who had built this system and who had profited from it, and some of those people would inevitably name names, and some of those names would inevitably lead back to this courtroom. He had 2 options. He could rule against the petition, return the children to state custody, and hope that the ensuing investigation could be contained. Or he could rule in favor, grant the guardianship, and position himself on the right side of what was about to become a very public scandal. Harwick Crane was not a good man, but he was a smart one, and smart men know when to change sides. "The court will recess for 30 minutes, he said. 30 minutes. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Calder stood by a window that looked out at Picasso's untitled sculpture in Chute Daly Plaza. The November wind was whipping around the base of the sculpture, sending leaves and litter spiraling across the concrete. He felt a presence beside him, small, tentative. Emmerich. The boy stood next to Calder, looking out the same window, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. They stood side by side, the man and the boy, both upright, both still, both carrying the same weight in different bodies, and the silence between them was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people who understand each other in a way that does not require language. "Whatever happens," Emmerich said quietly, "I want you to know something." Calder waited. "Nobody ever fought for us before. Not like that. The lawyer, the filing, He swallowed. "You risked things for us. Nobody ever risked anything for us." Calder looked at him. At this boy who had been standing guard for 3 years, who had bled in an alley to protect his siblings, who had offered to leave if it would keep them together. This boy who was, in every way that mattered, the same boy Calder had been at 14, older than his years, harder than his age, and carrying a weight that no child should know how to carry. It wasn't a risk, Calder said. It was a decision. Emmerich nodded. And then, without looking at Calder, without any preliminary gesture, he shifted his weight slightly to the left so that his shoulder was touching Calder's arm. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3, the briefest, most tentative physical contact imaginable. A 14-year-old boy who had not voluntarily touched an adult in 3 years, allowing his shoulder to rest against the arm of a man he was trying to trust. Then he straightened, stepped away, crossed his arms again. Rebuilt the wall, but it had happened, and both of them knew it. The recess ended. The courtroom reconvened. Judge Crane returned to the bench. He did not look at the state's attorney. He did not look at Cassius. He looked at the children in the gallery, 5 of them, pressed together, holding hands. The oldest bleeding in an alley, the youngest barefoot. He had a choice. "The court has reviewed the petition and the evidence submitted," Crane said. His voice was formal. The words were procedural. But his eyes, when they moved to the children, contained something that might have been, if you were generous, the ghost of the man he had once been before the system got to him. Given the documented history of placement failures, the evidence of systemic irregularities within the current DCFS chain of custody, and the absence of any viable alternative placement that maintains sibling unity. Solvay's hand tightened on Wren's. "The court grants emergency guardianship of the minor children, Emmerich, Solvay, Prosper, Sable, and Wren Vasiliev, to the petitioner, Calder Thassain, pending a full review of the DCFS placement record and a formal guardianship evaluation to be completed within 90 days. The gavel came down. The sound was small, a wooden hammer on a wooden block, a sound that happened in courtrooms thousands of times a day, all over the country, in cases that determined who lived where and who belonged to whom. But in this courtroom, on this Tuesday, for these 5 children, that sound was the sound of the world changing shape. The hallway outside the courtroom was fluorescent lit and institutional. It smelled like floor polish and old coffee. It was not a beautiful space. It was not a dramatic space. It was a government building hallway where people processed paperwork and waited for elevators and lived out the most consequential moments of their lives in between announcements from a PA system. Calder walked out of the courtroom. Cassius followed, already on his phone, already talking about the 90-day evaluation, the follow-up filings, the supervision requirements. Theron was by the elevator, eyes scanning, professional, vigilant. The children were in the hallway. They were standing in the same formation they had stood in since the alley. Emmerich in front, Solvay beside him, Prosper behind, Sable behind Prosper, Wren at the end. A chain, a constellation, 5 points of light held together by gravity and will. Calder's stopped. 6 feet away. 5 faces looked at him. 5 sets of eyes. 5 different questions, all of them the same question, asked in 5 different frequencies by 5 different hearts that had learned, through years of evidence, that good news was temporary and that the moment you believed in something was the moment it was taken away. Sable spoke first, because Sable always spoke first, through Mr. Pemberton, through the filter of a one-eyed stuffed rabbit that made the world small enough to be manageable. "Mr. Pemberton wants to know," she said, her voice trembling, "if we're staying." The question hung in the air. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang. The world continued in its ordinary bureaucratic way, and in the middle of it, a 6-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit was asking the only question that mattered. And then Wren spoke. For the first time in 11 months, Wren Vasiliev opened his mouth and used his voice. The sound that came out was small, so small that if you hadn't been listening, if you hadn't been waiting, if you hadn't understood that this silence had been the deepest wound of all, you would have missed it. Stay. 1 word, 1 syllable, a question and a prayer, and an entire childhood compressed into a single sound that cracked open the hallway like lightning cracks open the sky. Solveig's hand flew to her mouth. Emmerich turned, his eyes wide, wider than they had been in the alley, wider than they had been at any point in the last 11 days. Because his youngest brother, his silent, watchful, unreachable brother, had spoken. Prosper made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a laugh. Sable clutched Mr. Pemberton so tight the stuffing bulged. Calder Thesane looked at Wren, this 4-year-old boy in 2 new shoes, holding a faded yellow blanket covered in stars, standing at the end of a chain of siblings in a courthouse hallway in Chicago, Illinois. This boy who had stopped, speaking because the world had given him nothing worth speaking to. This boy who had just used his voice for the first time in almost a year to ask the only question any of them had ever needed answered. Calder lowered himself to one knee. He had never knelt. Not in business. Not in negotiation. Not in the 21 years since he had left the foster system and built himself into a man that no one could force to bend. Kneeling was vulnerability. Kneeling was submission. Kneeling was the posture of a person who has placed themselves below another person, and Calder Thesane had sworn at 15 years old that he would never be below anyone again. He knelt on the linoleum floor of the Daily Center, and he looked at Wren, and he looked at all of them: Emmerich, Solveig, Prosper, Sable, Wren. 5 faces, 5 hearts, 5 children who had survived things that no child should survive, and he said, all of you. 2 words. The same 2 words he had said in the alley. The same 2 words that had been the first thing these children heard from him, and that were now, in this hallway, the only thing that needed to be said. All of you. Sable broke first. She launched herself forward, rabbit and all, and collided with Calder's chest with the force of a 6-year-old who has been waiting her entire life for something to collide with. Her arms went around his neck. Mr. Pemberton was pressed between them, and Sable was crying, not the quiet, controlled crying of a child who has learned to cry silently, but the full, shaking, unrestrained crying of a child who has just been told she can stay. Prosper was next. He came forward slowly, hesitantly, his body still doing the careful calculus of risk and reward, and then his hand found Calder's shoulder, and he leaned in, and his forehead pressed against Calder's arm, and he breathed, and his breathing was steady, no stutter, no hitch, just breath after breath in the first easy rhythm his body had found in years. Solveig stood. She did not rush forward. She was not a rusher. She was a deliberator, a calculator, a girl who had spent her childhood being the calm one, the careful one, the one who held the others together while her own interior crumbled. She stood with her hands at her sides, and her mother's eyes shining, and she watched her siblings press against this man, and something inside her, some final, exhausted sentry that had been standing guard for 3 years, set down its weapon. She stepped forward. She put her hand on Sable's back, and she stood there in the circle, not touching Calder directly, but touching Sable, who was touching Calder, and the chain was unbroken, and that was enough. That was enough. Emmerich was last. He stood apart, 3 feet, his arms at his sides, his jaw working, his eyes, those burning, beautiful, exhausted eyes, were full of something he had been carrying for 3 years that was too big for his body and too heavy for his age and too much for one human being to hold alone. He looked at Calder, at this man kneeling on the floor of a courthouse with his siblings pressed against him, this man who had stepped into an alley and said 2 words and meant them, this man who had fought for them, not with fists, not with guns, but with lawyers and filings, and the strategic sacrifice of things that mattered to him, for the sake of 5 children who had been given no reason to believe they mattered to anyone. Emmerich's armor cracked, not dramatically, not with a sob or a collapse or a cinematic breakdown. Emmerich's armor cracked the way Emmerich did everything, quietly, fiercely, with his jaw clenched and his fists balled and his eyes burning, with the refusal to be broken by this, by any of this, by the sheer, unbearable, terrible mercy of finally, being told he could stop fighting. A single tear ran down his face. He wiped it with the back of his hand, hard, the gesture of a boy who could not let himself be. Soft. Not all the way. Not yet. But the tear was there. The crack was there, and Emmerich stepped forward into the circle, and his hand found Calder's shoulder, and he gripped it, not with the softness of a child, but with the grip of a young man who had just found something solid enough to hold. They stayed like that. In the hallway, under the fluorescent lights. 5 children, and a man kneeling on the floor, and the world moving around them. Lawyers with briefcases, clerks with files, families walking in and families walking out, and none of it touching them, none of it reaching inside the circle they had made. Calder closed his eyes. He held them, and the door inside him, the one that had been sealed for 21 years, the one that had cracked with a name tag and a yellow blanket and a hum in the sunlight and a shoulder against his arm, opened. Night. The penthouse on East Lake Shore Drive was quiet in the way that spaces are quiet when they have been changed by the people inside them. It was not the cold, architectural silence that had existed before, the silence of a man who lived alone in expensive emptiness. It was a different silence, a populated silence, the silence of a home that contains sleeping children. Sable was asleep on the couch in the living room, Mr. Pemberton tucked under her arm, his name tag facing outward. She had fallen asleep mid-sentence, as she often did, her whispered monologue to the rabbit trailing off into soft breathing, her body curling into the cushions with the instinct of a child who has finally found a surface she doesn't need to flinch away from. Prosper was asleep on the floor beside the couch, on a pile of blankets he had arranged himself, with a sketchbook open beside him. He had been drawing all evening, not anything specific, just shapes, spirals, the kind of abstract rhythmic mark-making that a 9-year-old boy uses to process a world that is too complex for words. The pencil was still in his hand. Solveig was asleep in the bedroom upstairs, in the center of the king-size bed, with Ren beside her. Ren was wrapped in the yellow blanket, his small body curved around it like a parenthesis, and his face, for the first time in months, was not empty. It was soft. It was the face of a child who was sleeping because he felt safe enough to sleep, which is a different thing entirely from a child who is sleeping because his body has run out of the energy to stay awake. Emmerich was not asleep. He was sitting in the third-floor hallway, his back against the wall, his legs stretched out in front of him. His post, his position. The same position he had occupied every night since the alley, the same sentry duty he had performed for 3 years. But tonight, his posture was different. His shoulders were lower, his hands were open on his knees, not fisted. His head was tilted back against the wall, and his eyes were half closed, and the muscles around his jaw, those muscles that had been locked at full tension since he was 11 years old, had softened by approximately 40%, which was for Emmerich a seismic relaxation. He was not sleeping, but he was resting, and there is a difference. Downstairs, Calder sat in the study. The lake was black outside the window. The city was a field of lights beyond it. 1,000,000 lit windows, 1,000,000 lives, 1,000,000 people making their way through the dark in the particular, stubborn, magnificent way that human beings make their way through the dark, which is to say imperfectly and afraid and together. He was thinking about Tuesday, about the hearing, about the 90-day evaluation that would begin next week, during which his home, his life, and his fitness as a guardian would be examined by people who did not know him and who would inevitably discover things about him that would complicate the evaluation. He was thinking about Lazaro, whose response to the hearing had been silence, the dangerous kind of silence, the silence that precedes a decision. He was thinking about the shipping routes and the territory and the alliances that would need to be managed, renegotiated, reinforced. He was thinking about all of this, and beneath it, he was thinking about a yellow blanket with stars on it, and a one-eyed rabbit named Pemberton, and a 9-year-old boy who had laughed once, quietly, at something Sable had said at dinner, a single, surprised laugh that had erupted from him like a bird escaping a cage, and the sound of a 4-year-old boy saying, "Stay," in a courthouse hallway. He heard footsteps on the stairs, light, careful, the footsteps of someone who knew how to move through a house at night without waking anyone. Emmerich appeared in the doorway of the study. He was wearing the clothes Maren had bought, a plain gray t-shirt, sweatpants, socks. His face was clean. The cut above his eye had healed to a thin, pink line that would become a scar, and the scar would stay with him for the rest of his life. And every time he looked in the mirror, he would see it and remember the night in the alley when everything changed. He stood in the doorway. Calder looked at him. "Can't sleep?" Calder asked. "Don't really sleep." "I know." Emmerich hovered, on the threshold. The same threshold he had been occupying since the beginning, the boundary between in and out, between trust and retreat, between the world he knew and the world he was being offered, and then he made a decision. He walked into the study. He sat down in the chair across from Calder. He sat there, in the leather chair, in the low light, with the lake outside the window, and the city humming below them, and his siblings asleep in the rooms above, and he let himself be in the room, not standing guard, not scanning for threats, not positioned for escape. Just sitting, just being present, just being 14. They sat in silence for a while. The kind of silence that doesn't need fill-in, the kind of silence that exists between two people who have seen each other clearly and have decided, provisionally, cautiously, with the full awareness that it might not work, to stay in the same room. "You meant it," Emmerich said. Not a question this time, a statement. "In the alley, in the study, in the courtroom. You meant all of it." Calder looked at him. This boy, this extraordinary, battered, unbreakable boy who had carried 4 lives on his shoulders for 3 years, and who was sitting in a chair in a study in a penthouse in Chicago and allowing himself, for the first time, to set the weight down. Not permanently, not completely, but for a moment. For one moment, in the dark, in the quiet, with a man who understood what the weight felt like because he had carried his own version of it for 21 years. "I don't break my word," Calder said. Emmerich nodded, slowly. The nod of a person who is taking something in, not just hearing it, but receiving it, allowing it to reach the place inside him where the important things were kept, the place he had locked and barricaded and defended for so long that he had almost forgotten what it was for. Believing. It was for believing. "Okay," Emmerich said, quietly, simply. The word of a boy who was choosing, with full knowledge of the risk, to trust someone, not blindly, not completely, but enough. Enough to sit in a chair, enough to breathe, enough to be in a room without watching the door. "Okay," he said again. And outside, the lake was black, and the city was bright, and the wind was cold, and in a penthouse on East Lake Shore Drive, 5 children slept under one roof, not clinging to each other in fear, not huddled against the dark, but resting, each in their own space, each in their own way, in a place that was beginning, slowly and imperfectly, and with the grinding patience of something real, to feel like home. And in the study, 2 people sat in the quiet. A man who had built an empire to fill the space where his family had been, and a boy who had carried his family so hard and so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to put them down. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. The silence held them both.